I'm so glad, Tracy, that we could do this. And do you mind kind of walking us through your school career from pre-Crossroads and Crossroads and beyond?
Oh, wow. Pre-Crossroads. So, um, kindergarten, I went to a school called Bethel Lutheran in St. Louis. And I went there for half a year. And my mother didn't like the way it was going. So she actually sent me to Dayton, Ohio.
Really?
Yeah, where my grandmother lived. And I went to school there for the rest of the half of the year. And then I came back. And then I enrolled in New City School
Okay.
in the city, so a private school. And I was there until fifth grade, I think. And I went to Holy Cross and I hated it. And I absolutely hated it. And I was, because I'm not Catholic.
Right.
And I was actually a pretty religious kid. I grew up Methodist, and they were trying to force me to believe Catholicism. And so that did not work.
Right.
So left there, and that's when I went to Crossroads seventh and eighth, because after Crossroads, I went to Cardinal Ritter College Prep, another Catholic school, for like a
Okay.
year. And the interesting thing is, at Crossroads, we were allowed to kind of work ahead of our grade level. It would stay in
Right.
the same grade.
Right.
So when I got to my freshman year at Cardinal Ritter, I was just over prepared, and I got straight A's without even blinking. Like I didn't even try.
Okay.
And so my mother was like, well, this isn't going to work. So from there, I went to Ladue High School through DSEG. And I was
Okay.
there for the rest of my high school career.
So you would have
And
graduated in 1989, is that right?
graduated in 89.
All
And
right.
then I went to Howard University
Okay.
and I graduated from Howard. And then from there, I jumped right into my career.
Outstanding. So tell us about your career, and we'll talk a little bit about that and other things going on in the world now, and
Yeah.
then jump back to Crossroads and how hopefully it helped, and if it didn't, whatever it might
Anyway,
be.
it
But,
definitely helped.
so
One thing I'll say about Crossroads, I met lifelong friends. Some of my closest friends I met at Crossroads, and we're still friends to this day. So that was the most beautiful thing to come out of that experience.
did you graduate from Howard majoring in broadcast journalism?
I did. My major was broadcast journalism. My minor was Spanish. I don't really speak Spanish,
Okay.
but I thought I would need it. It turns out I didn't. But yeah, I got my first job in TV. I started at a cable station in Maryland. So I was at Howard and then Gaithersburg, Maryland. I actually worked for free the first year just
Wow. Okay.
to get experience. And actually I did some crazy things. I turned down a job at CNN. It was like they had this video journalism program where you came in kind of as a trainee to become a producer, but I didn't want to be a producer. I wanted to be on air. So I turned that down. I was working for free at a cable station, like a city government station or county government station.
Right.
And then I got my first job I graduated in 93. So in 94, it was literally, I started, was it on my birthday? I think I started on May 8th on my birthday. And I worked in Clarksburg, West Virginia. I was an anchor
Wow.
reporter, but back then you had to, even if you were on air, you still just shoot your own stories, you had to edit them. But it was good. It was actually good training because I learned to do everything. I
Right.
anchored, I wrote stories, I edited, I shot them, I did the whole thing. So I produced newscasts, but it actually set me up for becoming a really good manager because I've done every job in the newsroom. So from there, I was there literally a year to the day. And then I moved to Roanoke, Virginia, and I was a reporter, fill-in anchor there. And so I was on air for a total of like 3.5 years. And I didn't I was making like next to nothing because in the TV business, you start out in small markets making very
Right.
little money and you work your way up. My first job paid me $12,000 a year. My
Mm,
second job paid $19,000 a year. And it's a grueling work. I mean, you work, especially back then, we didn't get overtime. We didn't get comp, you just worked. And so I really didn't like living in these small towns, and I didn't like it.
right,
So I ended up quitting my job without a job. I was driving back home to St. Louis, Missouri,
right.
and I stopped in Dayton, Ohio on the way, and I had a job interview there. And it actually went very well. They had me actually go out and shoot a story. I think they aired it, the story that I did, and then they
Mm,
froze the position. So I
mm,
went home and I was out of work for 6 months, I think. And I was working at a telemarketing firm
right.
and really embarrassed. And maybe I did. No, I went to the mall first. I was working at the mall. That's why I was so
Mm,
embarrassed. And people were coming in, and I was voted like most likely to succeed and all that stuff. So I was so embarrassed. Um, but I was there for a few months, and then I went to this telemarketing firm. And so at about the 6th month, my former mentor, so I had interned at a TV station in St. Louis when I was in
right.
college. And I did very well in the internship. And so the guy who was my supervisor, he was moonlighting at this telemarketing place. This is just
Ah, okay.
how God works. And so he's like, Tracie, what are you doing here schlepping tapes? You're supposed to be on air doing. And I'm like, oh, I quit my job and all this. And so he said, well, call the news director. So the news director at that time was one of my other supervisors when I was an intern. So he knew who I was when I called. And he said, well, I don't have a reporting position right now, but I have a writing job if you just need a job. He was like, come on in. So I went in and I just said it was an overnight writer editor
Wow.
position. Talk about humbling. So I was like, I'll do it because I need the money. I just needed to work and get my foot back in the door. And I
And
still
just
had
so that people have a sense of place, what are you at liberty to say what channel it was here?
oh yeah, it was KTVI, Channel
Okay,
2,
channel
Fox
channel
Station.
two.
Yeah.
At that point, was it still ABC or it had to become Fox?
Mhm. God, that was Fox. So when I interned
Okay,
there, when
okay,
I interned, it was ABC. But when I got
okay,
hired, it was Fox,
okay,
Fox O&O. And so I went there. I took the writing job, but because they knew I could report, whenever they were short reporters, they would send me out to pick up stories, and I was kind of like off-air reporter. And so I was writing and editing. I still had an agent. I was miserable. I could not find a job on TV, and I did that for literally a year. And I was praying about it. The consumer reporter, Jill Farmer, she's no longer there. She was praying for help because she wanted to go part time. And then
okay.
our sports producer was a friend of mine, and she was praying for me. And then so she was kind of like the catalyst. She knew what Jill Farmer wanted, she knew what I wanted. And then she went to the news director and said, you really need to do more with Tracie. Like, she can do more than this, and you guys aren't using her right. And so, literally, when Jill Farmer went to the news director saying, I can't work full time anymore, I need to find a way to go part time, I need to be there for my kids, then the news director came up with this idea of making me her producer.
Okay.
And so, because I was a former reporter, I could go out and do 3 stories a week, and she would just do 2, but she would voice them all. And so it was a win-win because I got to do what I really loved, which was writing the stories.
Okay.
And I really wasn't that pressed about being on the air. That wasn't the biggest part of it for me. I really loved the storytelling.
Yeah.
So I did that for like 18 months. I got rid of my agent. And then I just started exploring, like, what else can I do? And so I ended up talking to the special projects executive producer, and that person is in charge of all the investigative stories and the in-depth stories. And I was like, wow, that job seems like fun. And so I talked to him, and I was part of that unit. So running the consumer unit was part of the investigative unit. So I just asked him, like, how'd you get this job? What was your pathway? What do you love about it? and all of that stuff. Sorry, a friend of mine is texting me. And so anyway, I don't even remember how that happened. Though they created a position for me.
Ooh,
So
nice.
this is just all God. So it was senior producer special projects. So I got that title, I got more money, but I was still kind of doing the same thing. And I was praying about it. Well, then we got a new news director, and people were telling him about me, and he called me in his office and he said, I call you the mayor. And I said, why? He said, because I see the way you work the newsroom. You're really a leader. You should be leading. And I was like, what? And so he's like, I think you should go into management. And I'm like, man, why would I want to do that? So he's trying to talk me into it. Well, in that moment, I kid you not, I reflected on exactly 10 years prior. I was working as a reporter, and my news director at the time said, where do you see yourself in 10 years? And no, it was 5 years, 5 years. He said, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And I was like, I don't know, probably in management. And he said, management? How are you going to go from being a reporter to a manager? And I was like, I don't know. And he was like, why do you see yourself as a manager? I was like, because I'm not a foot soldier. Like, I like telling people what to do. I don't like being told what to do. And he was like, that's not going to work. So literally 5 years later, exactly, the news director's trying to convince me to go into management. And that's why I did it, because I remembered that conversation. And it's like I spoke it into existence. Like, who
Yeah.
knew that was I didn't know I'd have to be unemployed for 6 months and start working overnight and all these other things. But that's how it happened. And so I was with KTVI for 13 years, 13 and a half years. They just kept promoting me. They were creating positions for me. Ultimately, when I ended up becoming the executive producer of special projects, the same thing I'd interviewed that guy about. And then from there, they moved me to executive producer over the newscast. So I was the night side.
Wow.
And then they moved me to Fox sold KTVI to Tribune. No, first it was local TV. And local TV, they were an investment firm who had no TV experience, and they were just wanting to play around. So they decided to have us create all these shows, give us no additional resources. And so I ended up being executive producer over, it was like 4 or 5 shows, and it was miserable. And so I ended up quitting, and I went across the street and I was executive producer there for like 2.5 years, first night side, then days. And I grew all of their newscasts. At that time, literally anything I touched just turned to gold. Like that show became number 2, then became number 1. Then they moved me dayside. It became, I grew the number 1 lead. That's what it was, night side. And then they put me over dayside, which means like the 4, 5, 6. And I grew those by 36% in like less than a year. And so then I was asked to become an assistant news director, but I'd have to move to Norfolk, Virginia. And I originally said no, because I was like, I don't want to move. I love being an executive producer. It was so fun to me, and I loved my team, and I loved living at home. I had a boyfriend, I had a house, I had a dog. I was happy. My family was there. And that was the longest I'd been, in one place, because in this business, that doesn't happen. So in order to move, I had to move up. My mother, who was also in management, talked me into moving forward. And so I took the job in Norfolk, Virginia Beach market as assistant news director, which means I was the number 2 manager in the newsroom.
Right. So
I was there for about a year and a half, and then I went to Tampa as assistant news director. I was there for 3 years. And there I got a lot of experience. I was working for the same station that owns KSDK, the same company that owns KSDK. And so when the Ferguson riots happened, because I was from St. Louis and I'd worked in that market for 16 years, and from there, they said, send Tracie. So I ended up going to KSTK to help them. So I've actually worked at every station in the St. Louis market.
My goodness.
So I helped them through the riots. Then I went back for the verdict. I actually interviewed for the news director job there, didn't get it. So
No.
then I left that company. I went to another media company and ended up moving to Detroit. So I was assistant news director there for a year. And they promised if I grew those numbers, they would make me a news director. I grew the numbers. They made me news director in Las Vegas. Um,
Goodness.
yeah,
You are
I've
like
been
a ping pong
going.
ball.
Oh yeah, and then from there, I was there probably about a year. Didn't like it there. Switched to another company, the same company I work for now. I went to Pittsburgh. I was there for.
I read a story in a Pittsburgh newspaper about you. And
Oh,
yeah, yeah. And they said, the big story was another pretty face who didn't want to be on the air, wanted to be behind the scenes. You remember that?
no.
I'll get it. I've got it on.
No, I remember they did a story about me when I moved to the market.
Yeah,
Um, that's the only one I remember, and they kind of traced my steps or whatever.
I
Um,
will. I'll dig it up.
oh my
But
God.
so let's take a pause here. And you
Okay.
going from this market to that. Go back
Mhm.
to St. Louis for a moment. What are some of the big stories you remember covering?
Oh my gosh. So I remember it's fuzzy because I've been so many places, but I do remember the shooting at City Hall. What time was
In
that?
Kirkwood?
Kirkwood. Yeah. That was whew, that was
Yeah,
something.
Ricky
Um,
Thornton.
yeah, that was scary. I remember when Elliot Davis and oh God, the names are escaping me. What was our photographer's name? Washington was his last name. Ugh, I can think of his first name. But they were doing an investigative piece, and the photographer got shot.
And what?
He got shot.
Elliot?
No, his photographer.
Okay. Oh,
Yeah, I can't think of his first name. His last name is Washington. He's still at KTVI.
okay.
But that was like pivotal. I still use that when I talk because I work mostly with reporters, so and field crews, and so I talk to them about that because it's you have to stay safe, and especially if you're an investigative, because sometimes you upset people, you anger them, you expose
Right.
them, and that's what happened. They had been doing a series of reports on this company, and the company was unscrupulous and we were relentless in our reporting. And literally, Elliot got in the car, and the photographer was putting the gear back and got shot.
Oh,
Yeah, and he actually drove himself to the hospital because the reporter was more upset. Elliot was more upset than he was.
yeah.
But
Wow.
yeah, it just crazy. So
So when you were
for
in
9/11,
Pittsburgh
I
and you've
was
been in Atlanta, I mean, are there um, any particular characteristics of any, let's say those three where you've worked, which,
there. Mhm.
any community which you think is kind of got its act together better than others? Any one where you think, boy, it's really such a mess, particularly in terms of like the way government is organized or works or doesn't work?
I would say they're all very different.
Okay.
I would say what I like about working in Atlanta, um, it's the largest city I've worked in for
Right.
one, but I would say people here in terms of the government. Now, Georgia, the state has some ruthless tendencies, but
Right.
if you talk about Atlanta Metro, I think that here people are tolerant and leaders. Leaders are tolerant and um, responsive to the community. Um, of course, though, we've had some huge, like with George Floyd, there were lots of protests here
Right.
And the mayor at the time was trying to do right by the public, and she ended up being, really upsetting the police. But I think here what you find is the leadership is in the metro area responsive to its people. Now, they're not perfect and they don't get everything right.
Right.
And they certainly do enough to keep us in business. But
Now you mentioned
I
to
would say
me,
that, pardon me?
you mentioned to me that tomorrow night you're covering an election. Okay.
Yeah.
And elections in Georgia have really been big over the last 4 years or so.
Hmm.
Um, have you covered any of those? And are there any, uh, stories from that coverage that you think it would be important for people to know?
Well, anybody who's followed uh, Georgia politics anyway would know, and they became national. Um, After Trump lost, of course, he blamed Georgia.
Hmm.
Um, and all the election interference, that investigation we've covered very heavily. Very early on, there was an investigation launched and no impropriety was found. There was
Right.
no fraud. Even still, what's surprising to me, and this is not about party, I'm going to say that because I'm a journalist and it's not about party.
Right.
What I will say, it is surprising as a journalist to talk to leaders who, off the record and off camera, will tell you that they don't support Trump. They don't like his antics. But then when you turn on the camera, they will support him because they don't have another leader who they think can win.
Interesting. Interesting.
Georgia is very divided in that our governor, Brian Kemp, is seen as someone who could become president one day.
Right.
And so there are Republicans who are Kemp Republicans, and then there are those who are Trump Republicans.
Right.
And so it's interesting now, one of the stories we're doing is how is the party going to unify before the election? How will they come together?
Because Kemp is one Republican who has tried to distance himself from Trump, right?
He is.
Yeah.
He is. And
And then the lieutenant
Trump is
governor
very,
that you had, Duncan, he really, he wrote a book which I read, and I was very impressed with how he, clearly stood up for the principles that he had been brought up with and didn't just follow the Trump bandwagon.
well, there's a lot of that. There's
All
a lot
right.
of that. And it's just going to be interesting this election to see what happens, especially, one of the indictments that Trump faces is here for the
Right.
election interference
Right.
case. And unfortunately, the DA put that case at risk. So we've
Right.
covered that story very heavily, allowed our personal life to
Right.
taint the
Did not
case.
exercise the best judgment.
To taint the case. So you've got some chaos on both sides.
Right.
And so how is it going to play out? We don't know. But what we are doing tomorrow is not really a major election, it's the
Okay.
primary. But we want to make sure. So WSB is the most buttoned up station I've ever worked for. We're actually #1 local TV news in the country.
Really?
And
Huh?
that's in revenue and ratings. And it's a long standing history of that. It's a legacy station. And so our motto is do no harm. We care very much about preserving the trust of the public. And we work hard to do that. And we try to make sure our stories are as unbiased as possible. You have human beings, covering stories. So there's no such thing as objective. I mean, you strive for
Right.
that, but we all have our own perspectives. So that's why you want a diverse newsroom. So we work as checks and balances for each other. So part of what I do as managing editor, I run the day-to-day operations of the newsroom. And so I try to make sure that we are walking down, straight down the middle, that we are fair and balanced, that legally we are sound, and that it's also entertaining, because if it's not entertaining, people won't watch.
So,
So,
you can get 999 decisions right. And if you mess up on one, that's what people remember.
absolutely, absolutely. So I would say this market is where I've taken everything that I've learned and been able to um, kind of, having been in the business 30 years, kind of assess what works, what doesn't, but then also marry that with a station that has a winning formula that realizes it also has to adapt because our viewers have changed, they've adapted. And so it's how do we um, preserve our loyalists while attracting new viewers who really see news differently.
Well,
You
have there
know,
been any occasions when you have a story that you think would be good for ratings, but it just doesn't meet your journalistic standards and you have to kibosh it?
well, yeah, we have really rigorous debate in our editorial meetings. So we typically don't even go down that path
Okay.
if we think it's going to uh, if it doesn't fit our brand, quite honestly. Um, and so, somebody might pitch the story, we may talk about it, some people might think we should do it, but sometimes we've talked about a story for 2 hours if it warrants it, to make sure that we have a very diverse newsroom. So, and I mean age, race, religion, perspective, all of that. And so we try to hear from everyone and make sure we've truly assessed the room, because that's what our community is made of. And then we make the decision. And there have been some tough conversations. I
Yeah.
mean, there have been some really tough conversations about stories, that we just decided, no, it's not right. It's not the right time.
Yeah.
I'll give you one example. And it was actually right before I started. So it made national news. There were the spa shootings. So there was a person who went into these Asian spas, and he, shot them up, open fired. And then he said he was a sex addict, and he tried to blame it on that, basically blaming the victims. And so someone pitched in the meeting, it was probably a day or two after the initial shooting. Well, there's been a long-standing history of um, human trafficking in those spas, and we should do a story on sort of the sex trade and that happens in those spas. Well, I hadn't started yet. I was still at our station in Pittsburgh. And so when I was told about it, I was like, whoa, too soon. Well, unfortunately, damage was already done. They had a whole conversation about it. Unfortunately, most of the managers weren't in that meeting, and so they didn't put the kibosh on it. People got so offended. We have Asian reporters on staff who were very offended. And our general manager ended up sending an apology to the team, and he copied me on it because I was going to be walking into it. But what I will say about our leaders is that even our upper management, if we make an error in our thinking or our judgment, it's caught before it hits air.
Okay.
and our leaders are good at listening to the team and walking it back. And so I was so impressed before I even got here when I saw the note from the general manager, and he fell on the sword, even though he wasn't in the meeting. But
Good
he
for
fell
you.
on the sword and apologized and
So
explained
Atlanta is you're very comfortable there. It's the best
it is
locale
as an
you've had.
African American woman manager, this is the most secure I've ever felt in my role. I've worked at I've been in management more than 20 years, and um, oftentimes was afraid to pitch a story in my own community, because of how I would be seen. At one point, I was a news director in Las Vegas, and I had hired 5 people before I hired someone who was Black. And the second I did, I was accused of hiring her because she was Black.
Mm.
Yeah. So I've been through the storm, but when I got here, my news director is a white woman, and she has half of her management team is Black, and she hired them. And I was so impressed by that. And I'm her number 2. Um, and that says a lot about who she is, about who our general manager at the time, who he was, and even our corporate leaders. My position has to be signed off by corporate. And they picked me. I didn't even want to come. They came and found me. um, but it's wonderful to be at a place where we can have robust conversations about all topics. And we have to in order to cover them fairly and accurately.
It's really exciting to see how you've risen up the ladder, the markets, the positions. And so often when people kind of get kicked upstairs, they're at a place where they don't want to be. But you seem to be really, really happy where you
I
are.
am. Well,
And so much hard work and difficult times seem to have paid off.
Yeah,
I want
we're
to ask you just
so
before we go,
yeah.
it may only have been 2 years of your life, but any thoughts you have about Crossroads at this point?
Oh my goodness, yes. I remember Crossroads so fondly. And one of the things that sticks out to me was how we were able to affect change with like petitions. And I remember we wanted to have off-campus privileges.
Right.
And so we were told, if you can get a petition going, if you can get enough people to sign it, then we'll consider it. And so we did. And I remember we were able to walk down the street to that sandwich shop for lunch and come back if we were in pairs. But
Right.
that was the beginning of really, for me, learning um, the power of persuasion, and how to affect change and lead. And when you're intentional about something and have a passion behind it, and having a free mind. As a 7th grader, um, who would even ever think you could affect change as a 7th grader? You know what I mean?
Right.
But the fact that we were listened to, that what we were thinking was considered, when it happens to you at such a young age, it takes the shackles off your mind. And you start to think outside, you color outside the lines, you think outside the box.
Yeah.
I'm now a manager and a leader who says, I tell my team, don't just think outside the box, crush it. And I think that started at Crossroads.
Yeah.
It started when I was challenged to think differently. I remember one of my teachers, we all had to learn it was a literature teacher. I don't remember his name though, but we had to learn a word for the week. And the very first word he assigned to us, and we could pick after that, but mine was loquacious.
But
And he said, look it up and tell me why. And so that stuck with me because it's so true. I'm such a talkative person.
Well, it's charming. Could it have been Cal Fussman, the teacher? Does that name ring a bell?
Yes, his name, yes.
Okay, so Cal is remarkable. I mean, what he's done now, he has podcasts, but he interviewed Mandela. Larry King became a really good friend of his. A number of people. I will send you his website, but he would love to hear from you. And I have a special reason for wishing that you would reach out to him, because I'd love to have him come to the reunion. And you.
Yeah.
He had been a reporter for the Post-Dispatch before coming to Crossroads. And then I think he's living in Roanoke now, but he'd been in LA for a number of years. And he
Oh,
he,
wow.
he does stand-up shows, and gets big audiences, and he's apparently made a lot of money. So
Oh, wow. You know, I was in
kudos to you
Roanoke
and
for
everybody who had him, whether they were loquacious or not.
a time.
Yeah.
Well, I remember that about him. And he also tried to get me to play basketball, but I didn't want to do that.
Okay. Well,
But
like you, he was short.
yep, yep.
Yep.
Yeah, no, he was great. He was great. There were so many great. And like I said, the other thing I love about Crossroads, I've met some of my closest friends there. And
That's awesome. Yeah.
I remember there were six of us. Marquita, we actually got in touch with her. For some reason, I think maybe she passed, but I'm not sure.
Who are
But
you talking about?
Marquita, do you remember her? I think she was there
Yeah.
like 1 year.
Yeah.
I was just trying to think of, I know there were like six girls and six guys. We all hung out, and Brian Gilby and John Tebow, and who else did I run into? Scott Levine,
Chris.
Eve Burge. We've been in like we all reconnected on Facebook. So, but yeah, but Roslyn and Nikki literally are my two best friends,
That's
and
awesome.
I'm
That's
the
awesome.
godmother of their children. And yeah, that all started at Crossroads.
Well, look, I'm going to do something you're familiar with and far better than me, that being editing, to try to cut it down a little bit. But this has been terrific. I'm so happy we reconnected. I'm so
Yeah.
happy with what you're doing. I feel better knowing that you're on the case with what's going on in Atlanta and in Georgia.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Thank
Yeah.
you.
No, it's been a pleasure. And just thank you for the influence that you had over my life. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Very kind. We'll stay in touch.
Okay. Sounds
Thanks,
good.
Tracie.